Welcome to Using the Tools with Clinical Quality Language, or CQL. My name is Dawn Gray, and I'm the trainer for the Measure Authoring Tool, or the MAT, development team. So this training session will cover the MAT version 5.4 and the Bonnie tools, and how they will change to accommodate the creation of electronic clinical quality measures, or ECQMs, using CQL. Today's presentation will include an overview of what CQL is, what this change means for the MAT, a live demonstration of the MAT version 5.4 that will be released into the production environment and will be ready for use by Monday, November 13th, 2017, a live question and answer session that includes panelists from the ESAC and the Bonnie teams, the Bonnie tool demonstration, and then some helpful resources regarding CQL. What is clinical quality language? This description has been paraphrased from information found on the eCQI Resource Center. Clinical Quality Language, or CQL, is an HL7 standard for trial use, STU. It is part of the effort to harmonize standards between electronic clinical quality measures, ECQMs, and clinical decision support, CDS. CQL provides the ability to express logic that is human-readable, yet structured enough for processing a query electronically. CQL will replace the logic expressions currently defined in the Quality Data Model, or QDM. And QDM now includes only the conceptual model for defining the data elements, the data model. The benefits of using CQL for ECQMs include, but are not limited to, the following: improved expressivity, more precise and unambiguous. You can share logic between measures. You can share logic with decision support. It can be used with multiple information data models. It simplifies calculation engine implementation. And CQL can perform mathematical calculations for better comparisons. So what does this mean for the MAT? The MAT has had almost a complete makeover to accommodate the change to using CQL to author measures. CQL does not use clauses, but instead uses definitions and functions that are able to be constructed in a variety of ways in order to create the logic used for the measures. To do this, the base structure of how the MAT takes in the logic input had to be changed to a more free-form format in order to allow for the flexibility in CQL. We have also added new exports for the new format and retired a few others that were no longer needed. The MAT is still using the QDM as the data model. It's important to note that measure developers need to understand CQL and its syntax prior to attempting to author measures in the MAT. All logic now needs to be entered in the correct CQL format in order for the measure to be packaged and successfully exported. All measures that were written prior to the release of the MAT version 5.4 will be versioned, and no changes will be allowed to be made in the old QDM format. Upon drafting a previously written measure, the system will be set for all changes to now be made using CQL. So let's jump into the tool and take a look at the new MAT with CQL. As you can see just by the login screen alone, the look and feel of the MAT has changed. However, the login functions the same way as the current production version of the MAT. You would enter your user ID, your password, and then your semantic VIP security code to access the system. A successful login still takes you to the UMLS account login page, where you can enter your UMLS license credentials. The Measure Library tab has had a few changes that help to make the system more intuitive and make certain functions easier for the user. The Measure Library has a Recent Activities section in the upper left-hand, a new measure icon and a search section in the upper right, and the measure table in the bottom half of the screen. Upon loading of the Measure Library, the measures that are shown in the measure table are filtered by the measures that are owned by or shared with the user that's currently logged into the MAT. If you would like to see the other measures that are housed within the system, you would simply uncheck the box that says Filter by My Measures and search again. You can narrow down the list by typing search criteria into the search box and then clicking on the search button. The Recent Activity table will show the last 2 measures that have been accessed by the user. If this is your first time in the system, this table will be blank. Once you have found the measure you would like to view, you can open it by clicking on the measure name. The measure library also contains a number of icons which allows users to manage the measures that they own. We're going to start with the New Measure icon in the upper right of the measure library screen. This icon is represented by a light bulb and the words New Measure, and it's here to allow users an easy way to start a brand new measure in the mat. Clicking on this icon will take you to a screen where you can give your new measure a name, an abbreviated name, choose a measure scoring type, and choose whether the measure is patient-based. Next in the measure table, we will go from right to left. So the first icon we're going to talk about is the export icon. The export function is represented by a downward-facing arrow going into a computer processing unit. This icon only appears on measures that have had a measure package created. Clicking this button gives the user access to the export artifacts associated with that version of the measure. You would then select the individual export you wanted or the whole package and either open it or save it. The next icon is the clone icon, and it's represented by 2 sheets of paper. Cloning allows users to copy a measure that has already been written, modify it, and then save it as a new but similar measure. You can only clone a measure that you own, and measures that were written prior to the implementation of CQL are not available for cloning until they have been converted into the current format. Clicking on the clone icon will create the clone and bring a user to a screen where they need to give their new measure a new name, a new abbreviated name, choose the scoring type, and the patient-based indicator. Just to the left of the clone icon is the share icon. It's represented by a curved arrow in a green square. Sharing a measure with another measure developer will give them the rights to edit that measure and create measure packages. You can only share a measure that is owned by you. Clicking on the share icon will take you to a screen where you can choose the person or persons you wish to share the measure with and then click Save and Continue. To the left of the share icon is the Edit column. This column can hold 3 different icons: the Edit icon, the Read Only icon, and the Lock icon. Clicking on the Edit icon, represented by a yellow pencil, will take you to a screen where you can change the name and/or abbreviated name of the measure scoring type, or the patient-based indicator for the measure. The Read Only icon is represented by a newspaper, and it lets users know that the measure cannot be edited in its current state. This could mean that the measure is versioned or not owned by or shared with the current user. You can open the measure and look at it, but you cannot make any changes. The Lock icon is represented by a padlock, and it only appears on measures that have been shared with other users and indicates that one of those other users currently has the measure open, and therefore it's not available to be edited. Again, you can open the measure for review, but editing will not be allowed until the other user's lock has been released. Just to the left of the Edit column is the History icon, represented by a clock. Clicking on this icon will give the user a change history log of the measure. And this brings us to the Create Version/Draft column. This column is home to 2 icons, the Version icon and the Draft icon. The Version icon is represented by a gold star. This is the icon to use when you want to create either a major or a minor version of the measure. You will only see this icon on measures that are currently in a draft state and that are owned by you. Clicking on the gold star icon will take you to a screen where you can choose to create either a major or a minor version. The draft icon is represented by a piece of paper with a pencil and will appear on any versioned measure that is owned by you. Clicking on this icon will create a new draft of a measure which will allow you to make changes to it. We need to stop here for a moment and talk about what happens when you have a measure that you wrote prior to the implementation of CQL and you now create a draft of that measure to edit it. The first thing to note is that all measures that are in a draft state when the release of version 5.4 occurs will be versioned with a minor version number. This is crucial to ensure a clean transition from the QDM logic-based measure to a CQL-based measure. What this means is that you will not be able to make any additional changes to those measures unless you create a new draft, which will then facilitate your ability to convert the measure into CQL. When you create the first draft of a measure that was written prior to the change to CQL, a few things will occur. Your value sets will be transferred to the new value set section. However, since CQL handles them differently, they will no longer be connected to a data type. And if you have the same value set paired to different data types in your data elements section, only one instance of that value set will be transferred. CQL does not use specific occurrences. As such, any specific occurrences will be removed, and the same is true for item counts. Clauses are no longer utilized. This means the logic will all need to be rewritten using CQL definitions and functions. However, we have retained the clauses in a reference-only area for you to refer to as you need. As the clauses are no longer used, and the populations no longer contain logical operators, the population workspace has been cleared and adjusted to receive CQL definitions and functions. And as the populations are cleared, we also need to clear the measure groupings. Again, all of these changes are to set up your measure to be able to use CQL to express your logic. So let's make a draft of a previously written measure and take a look at the rest of the system. The Measure Details tab is very similar to the current mat. At the top is a collapsible section that contains all of the general measure information. All fields within this section are read-only. To save space, you can click on the heading again to collapse the section. The rest of the fields contain the same information as the current production version of the mat, so we won't go over each one. But you may notice that the endorsed by NQF and the NQF number fields are now next to each other, and the measure steward list has now been converted to a drop-down list to save space. And the three new measure types, appropriate use process, intermediate clinical outcomes, and patient-reported outcome performance, are now available in the measure type list. There is both a Save button and a Delete Measure button at the bottom of the screen and at the top. The next tab, the CQL Workspace, is where you will create the logic that will make up the majority of the measure. The CQL Workspace is separated into 8 sections, which are listed in the left-hand navigation. The first section is the General Information section. Just as in the General Measure Information section on the Measure Details page, everything on this section of the CQL Workspace is read-only. The first field is the name of the CQL library. Whenever you create a measure using CQL, you are also creating a CQL library, which is a repository for all of the data and logic elements of the measure. The name of this library is created for you from the measure name, but it is cleaned up to remove any spaces and/or special characters, and, as it cannot start with a number, any numbers in the beginning of the measure name will be removed. Once this name is created with the creation of the measure, the library name will not change, even if the measure name is changed. The next field is the version of the CQL library. After that, we have the model the mat is currently using and the version of that model. All of this information is generated for you by the mat. The next section is the Include section. This area is used to add in additional CQL libraries that are already created into your measure, which allows you to share pieces of logic, value sets, and/or codes from those libraries with your current measure. We're going to skip over this section for now, and we're going to come back to it a little later in the presentation. Then we move on to the value sets section. If you are drafting from a previously written measure, you will already see some value sets in the value set table at the bottom of the screen. If this is a brand new measure, the table will be blank to start. This section functions very similarly to the Data Elements tab in the previous version of the mat. However, there are a couple of differences. The first difference is that when working with CQL, the value sets are not paired to a data type at this stage. Rather, you only need to enter a value set once, and then you can pair it with any appropriate data type when you create your logic definitions or functions. The other change is that we have removed the expansion profile and the default expansion profile fields per recommendations from NLM. To add a value set, you would input the value set OID, click the Retrieve OID button. Don't forget to make sure that you're logged into UMLS before retrieving. And once the information is returned from VSAC, you can verify that it's the correct value set. You can select a version if you wish, and then you click the Apply button, which will move it into the table below. The table includes two icons to help manage your value sets. There is a Delete button, represented by a trash can, which will remove that value set from the list of value sets included in the measure. This delete icon will not be available if the value set has been used within your CQL file, and if there are no errors in that CQL file. The other icon is the Edit icon, represented by a pencil. Clicking this icon will put the information from the value set back into the Retrieve section at the top. You will first need to re-retrieve the value set, and then you can make a change to it. The next section facilitates the use of another advantage using CQL for eCQMs. The Codes section allows you to reference a single code within your measure. These direct reference codes, or DRCs, can be added into the measure in a similar fashion to the value sets. However, instead of retrieving an OID, you will retrieve a code identifier offered up by VSAC. Every measure starts with two DRCs already added for you, birth date and dead. If you would like to add additional codes, you would find the code identifier in VSAC by choosing the Browse Code Systems, then search for the one that you want. Find your code. Then you want to make sure that the radio button is set to Measure Authoring Tool, and click the Copy button. We can go back to the tool, paste that into our Retrieve, and click on the Retrieve button. The rest of the fields will populate with the information received from VSAC, and you can verify that you have retrieved the correct code, and then click the Apply button. The Parameter section also contains a default entry meant to assist you with constructing your measure. The measurement period has been added and refers to the measurement period that you indicated on the Measure Details page. However, you can add additional parameters to your measure if you wish. For example, we will add a look-back period. So I'm going to give my new parameter a name. And then enter my logic into the CQL editor, which is this open text area in the middle of the screen. And then click the Save icon to save the expression. There is also a comment section here. Entering a comment into this text field will add the comment in line with the parameter in the CQL file export only. To clear the workspace to add yet another parameter, you can click on the Add New link at the top. There's also additional icons here, but we will cover those in the next section. Once you have all the parameters you need, you can move on to the definition section, which is where you will construct most of the logic contained within your measure. As this is where you will likely spend the majority of your time in the mat, we will take a little extra time to look at all of the features and functions in this section. At the top of the section is the Add New link. This link will clear all work out of the workspace to prepare it for a new definition. However, if this is the first time you enter the definition section, the workspace is already clear, so you can just go on to create your definition. Below that is the definition name field. This name will act as the identifier for the definition in the CQL file. As such, it should be a descriptive name, and it also needs to be unique. This means that you cannot give a definition the same name as a value set or code that you have entered into your measure, nor should you name it the same as a data type or attribute, as that will be confusing for the implementers and may cause your CQL file to be invalid. Choose whether the definition is patient or population based. And then we come to the comments field. Just like in the parameter section, comments entered here will appear in line with the expression in your CQL export. This field is optional. The next field is the return type field. This will be automatically filled in by the mat when you save your definition into a valid CQL file. Then we get to the CQL editor. This is a free text area where you enter your logic using CQL standard and syntax. However, we have included a few things to make your entry a little easier. The first of which is a number of shortcut keys which will assist you in entering attributes, data types, definitions, functions, keywords, parameters, timings, value sets, codes, and units. A listing of these shortcut keys can be found by clicking on the information icon above the CQL editor, which is represented by a circle with a lowercase I in it. Moving across to the rest of the icons, we have the Save icon, which will save your expression and validate it to ensure it's written in proper CQL syntax. The Erase icon, which will clear out your CQL editor without clearing out the other fields. And then we have the Insert icon, represented by a blue square with a white plus sign in it. The Insert icon is here to assist you in inserting items into your CQL editor in the correct CQL syntax. By using the Insert icon, you can insert parameters, definitions, functions, common timings, predefined functions, value sets and codes you have entered into your measure, and attributes. The parameters, definitions, and functions options all give you a list of those items that you have already put into your measure. For example, the parameters selection will give you all of the parameters that you have defined in your parameters section. In this measure, we have the default measurement period and the look-back period that we created earlier. The Applied Value Sets / Code selection will give you a list of the value sets and codes you have currently included in the measure. You will also get another drop-down which will allow you to pair it to a data type if you wish. The timing and the predefined function options will give you a list of items that have already been included in the mat for your use. The timing will give you a list of common timings used within CQL. It's important to note that this is not an exhaustive list, but is meant to be a starting point, and measure developers can put additional logic around them to do a more complex timing. The predefined function section gives you a list of predefined functions within the tool. For example, age and years at. Most of these functions also require additional logic to fully utilize them. So to illustrate, we're going to use our age and years at function. We're going to create an initial population. And then in my CQL editor, I'm going to utilize the Insert icon. I'm going to choose my predefined functions and select age in years at and click Insert. Then I'm going to put the cursor inside the parentheses. I'm going to type start of. And I'm going to go back to my insert icon. I'm going to choose parameters, and then I'm going to choose our lookback period. Click insert, then put my cursor outside of the parentheses and type greater than or equal to 65 and click save. When you save a definition into a valid CQL file, a couple of things happen. As long as there are no errors in the definition, the expression will be formatted automatically, and the system will determine the return type and put that information in the return type field. Now I will click on the Add New link to clear the workspace, and we will look at the last option in the Insert icon. Clicking on the Attributes option will open up the Attribute Builder. The Attribute Builder is handy for creating attributes with additional logic to assist in narrowing down your results. In the Attribute Builder, the first field is the Attributes by Data Type field. This field is optional in the Attribute Builder, and the selection made here will not be inserted with the attribute. However, making a selection here will filter the list of attributes in the next field based on the data type chosen. So if you're using an attribute with, say, an encounter performed, when you get to the second field, the Attributes field, the list of available attributes will be narrowed down to only those attributes that are appropriate for use with that data type. Choosing the appropriate attribute will determine what appears in which fields in the rest of the builder. The Mode field has 5 possible selections: comparison, computative, nullable, value sets, and codes. However, only the options that are appropriate for the attribute chosen will be available for selection. The Mode Details field is filtered based on what is chosen for the mode. For example, if the mode chosen was nullable, the options in the Mode Details field would be is null or is not null. However, if the mode chosen was computative, the items in the Mode Details list would be things like greater than, equal to, div, or mod. The datetime field is only enabled when an attribute and/or mode is chosen for which entering a datetime makes sense. For example, if a user chooses the attribute refills and then a comparison mode, a less than or equal to for the mode details, then adding a datetime does not make sense. Therefore, the fields are disabled. When you are entering a datetime, the user must state the items in this order: year, month, day. For example, a user could enter only a year, but if they wanted a certain month, they would need both the month and the year. Similarly, if they wanted a specific day, they would need the month and the year as well. The time fields work the same way. In order to have minutes, a user must have hours, and so on. A user can enter only a date, only a time, or a date and a time together. The quantity and units fields go hand in hand. Again, these fields will be enabled or disabled based on the choices made for the attributes and mode. For example, if the attribute is author datetime, and the mode is comparison, with a mode detail of less than or equal to, then entering a quantity and a unit does not make sense, so these fields will be disabled. However, if the user chose a computative mode with a plus for the mode detail, then a user could enter a quantity, for example 2, and a unit will go with months, and that would be correct. Once all the selections you would like are made, clicking on the Insert button will put the attribute phrase into the CQL editor. The final icon is the Delete icon. This icon is represented by a blue trash can. This icon will completely remove a previously saved expression from the measure. Definitions that are currently in use, either within another expression or in the measure population, are not available to be deleted. It's important to note that once an expression is deleted, it cannot be retrieved and would need to be recreated if needed again. Below the CQL editor is the Click to View CQL section. This is a section that was added per user request that will allow you to see other definitions in the measure while you are working on the current definition. This is a collapsible field, so to view it you just click on the heading, and the current CQL file for the measure will be displayed in a window below. You cannot make any edits in this window. It is for reference purposes only. You can collapse the section by clicking on the heading again, and the field will also collapse anytime an expression is saved to allow for a refreshing of the information contained therein. All saved definitions will appear in the definition list along the left-hand side of the screen. This list is searchable with this search box here. To open a previously saved definition to edit it, double-click on the definition name in the list. And now let's take a moment to talk about errors in your definition. If you create a definition in CQL that is not syntactically correct, you will receive an error message. These messages are generated through the CQL to ELM parser that was developed by the same folks who are in charge of the CQL standards, so we can have faith in those results. When an error occurs, you will see a red square with an X in it on the line where the system could no longer understand your expression. Hover your cursor over that icon and read the error message to troubleshoot your definition. Even if your definition has errors, it will be saved and will show in the list on the left. That way you can come back to it later to make the necessary adjustments. However, you must have a CQL file with no errors in it in order to be able to package or version your measure. The next section is the function section. This section allows you to create functions which can be used in your definitions to further specify the logic. To create a new function, we first need to give it a name. We're going to choose whether the function is patient-based or population-based. You can add a comment if you would like to. Then we need to add any arguments needed by clicking on Add Argument. We then need to give our argument a name. I'm going to choose a QDM data type and go with Encounter Performed and click Add, and you can see the argument is added into the arguments list. And then we're going to use our CQL editor to enter the logic for the function. Clicking on the save icon will initiate validation of the logic, and if all of the logic in the current CQL file is without validation errors, the system will show what that current function is returning in the return type field above the CQL editor. You can see that we have the information, save, erase, insert, and delete icons here for your use as well. We also have the Click to View CQL. And finally, we have the View CQL section. The View CQL section is there to allow you to see all of the CQL logic from beginning to end as it currently stands. This view will also show you if there are errors within the logic and on which lines those errors are occurring. This section is for reference only and is uneditable. Therefore, if there is an error, you will need to return to where the problem expression was created and fix any errors there. I'm going to switch measures here so that I can better demonstrate the population workspace and the measure packager. The population workspace has not changed much from the pre-CQL version of the tool. The population subtabs and populations displayed in this workspace are based on the measure scoring type that was chosen when the measure was created. One of the biggest changes to this page is that the populations no longer use logical operators to define them. All logic needed to properly express a population should be contained in one single definition. Therefore, the only thing you need to do in this section is choose the populations needed and pair them with the definitions you wrote for them. To define a population, you would follow these steps. I'm going to expand the list of populations by clicking on the plus icon above the list. Highlight the population subheading of the population to be added, for example, initial population 1. Right-click to display the menu of allowable actions. Select Add Definition, and then select the definition that is to stand for that population from the dialog box, and click Select. You're only able to select one definition per population, so again, it's important to ensure that all of the logic necessary in a population exists within a single definition in the CQL Workspace. If you discovered that you need a different definition than the one you have already applied, you can simply right-click on the definition name, choose Replace, and then pick a different definition from the list. You can also delete a definition in the same manner. To add additional populations, you would highlight the name of the main population heading to be added in the populations list. Right-click and select Add Initial Population. You can delete populations the same way. However, populations will retain their assigned number even if one of the existing populations is deleted. For example, initial population 2 will remain initial population 2 even if initial population 1 is deleted. The ability to view the human readable version of the definition is still available from this screen. You just right-click on the subheading name and choose View Human Readable. It's important to note that you may need to allow pop-ups in order to see this view, and the human readable version will only generate if the definition does not have any CQL validation errors. If it will not generate, that's a good sign that you may need to go back to the CQL Workspace and fix your definition. Once you have all of your populations added, don't forget to click on the Save button at the bottom of the screen. There is also the Stratification subtab in the Population Workspace, and depending upon the measure scoring type, there may be a Measure Observation subtab as well. Stratifications are added and deleted similarly to the Population subtab. However, stratifications have another level called stratum. A single stratification can have multiple stratum, and a single measure can have multiple stratifications. Although you can only have one stratification per measure grouping. Definitions are added to the stratum level on this subtab. The Measure Observation subtab, if available, again adds and deletes information in the same way as the Population subtab. However, instead of attaching definitions, you will be attaching functions. You can attach both an aggregate function and a user-defined function, or you can attach only the user-defined function, but an aggregate function without a user-defined function is not allowed. Once you have paired expressions to all of the populations you need, you can move on to the Measure Packager tab. The first thing you will notice is that if there is an error in your CQL logic, the Measure Packager tab will not load. You will need to go back to the CQL Workspace and correct the CQL logic before continuing. So once the page loads, the first step is to create your measure package groupings. A single measure must contain at least one measure grouping in order to package correctly, but can have more than one if needed. Only populations that have had a definition or a function paired to it will show under the populations heading. If you want to include the population into your measure grouping, you can highlight it by clicking on it and use the arrow pointing to the right to move it into the package grouping section. Once you have moved all of the populations that you would like into your measure grouping, you can click on the Save Grouping button. Upon saving, validations will kick off to ensure that the populations you have included in the grouping are returning the correct type of data for the measure scoring and the patient-based indicator for the message. This one also states that I have a measure observation that needs an association, so I'm going to click on that. My Add Associations shows up on the right, and I can add that to the denominator and click Save Grouping again. And then once again it validates for the correct return type of the data. So I've got two errors here. My numerator 1, because this is a patient-based measure, should be returning a Boolean. And it's also telling me that I cannot have a measure observation in a ratio measure unless the measure is episode-based, and this is a patient-based measure. So the measure observation should not be there. So I need to correct these errors. So I go back to the CQL Workspace. I'm going to go back into my definitions, choose my numerator, which is the one that was causing the problem, and you can see it's returning a list, and I need it to return a Boolean, which is a true-false expression. And I'm going to correct it so it's now returning a true-false. I'm going to go back to my measure packager and create the measure grouping again. Although this time I am not going to include the measure observation. And hit Save Grouping. If you need to add additional measure groupings, you can simply click on the Create New Grouping button and repeat the process again. Your saved measure groupings end up in the measure grouping list up here at the top. And there are icons here if you want to edit the populations that are in your grouping, or if you want to delete it outright. Moving on to the Supplemental Data Elements section, you may notice that it functions similarly to the Measure Grouping section. A list of your definitions is on the left, and on the right are the definitions that will be included in your measure when packaged. Again, definitions move from left to right with the arrows in between the boxes, and as in the current production environment, we start with the 4 default SDEs, or supplemental data elements, already added for you. Then we have the risk adjustment variables section, which again functions the same way. Definitions on the left, and you move them to the right if you want them included in your measure as a risk adjustment variable. Anytime you make an adjustment in the measure packager, you will want to save the changes with the save buttons that are at the bottom of each section. Once you've chosen all the pieces of the measure, it's time to package it. Just as in the previous version of the MAT, you have two options: Create Measure Package or Create Measure Package and Export. The difference comes in what exports the MAT produces. I'm going to package this quickly. Go. You still have the HQMF and the human readable, just as before. They just look a little bit different due to the use of CQL for the logic. So let's open up the human readable and take a quick look at the differences. The top of the human readable is still pretty much the same. The differences occur when we get to the logic section of the document. The population criteria section show the definitions that have been paired to each population. The definitions section shows all of the definitions that were included within the measure. The function section shows any functions used within the measure. The terminology section shows the value sets and direct reference codes used in the measure. The data criteria section shows the QDM data elements used within the measure. And then of course it still shows the supplemental data elements and the risk adjustment variables. Additionally, in your measure package, you will now find a CQL file, an ELM file, and a JSON file. The CQL file looks just like the View CQL section in the CQL Workspace. The ELM file is a computer-readable representation of the CQL file, and the JSON file is a JavaScript representation of the ELM file. You may also have noticed that two exports have been removed from the measure package. The VSAC value set spreadsheet is no longer being provided, as VSAC is the source of truth for all value set and code information. Additionally, we have removed the simple XML export, as it was not a standardized format and of no implementable use. There are three more tabs in the Measure Composer that we need to touch on briefly: the Measure Notes tab, and the two tabs that are read-only and have no functional use for a measure with CQL, but we have retained them for reference purposes as the measures are being drafted into the new format. I'm going to change measures one more time. The Measure Notes tab has not changed from the current production version of the mat, so we won't go over every step today. Just remember that the notes entered here do not show on any of the exports, but you can export them into their own document by using the Export Notes button on this tab. The CQL Workspace looks just as it did in the current production version of the mat. However, you cannot complete any actions on this tab other than viewing the clauses, as they were when they were written in the QDM logic-based measure. You will not be able to create any new clauses or edit any of the ones that are already here. And finally, we have the QDM Elements tab. This tab has had all functionality removed except for the table which showed the paired QDM elements. Again, this is just for reference purposes only. And now we're going to switch gears for a moment and talk about a concept that is new for CQL-based measures. You may have noticed these two new tabs at the very top of the tool: the CQL Library and the CQL Composer. These areas of the tool were created to allow users to create a CQL file, also known as a library, that contains parameters, definitions, and/or functions, with the ultimate goal that these pre-written statements could then be used within one or more measures. These standalone CQL libraries allow a sharing of logic between multiple measures. For example, your organization may have one person who is very proficient in writing CQL. Potentially, this person could write the CQL expressions for the measures as standalone CQL libraries, and then the developer responsible for the measure could just call the definitions out of the standalone library to complete their measure. Another way, and probably more common way to use them, is to create standalone CQL libraries that have common definitions in them. To illustrate, if you tend to use the same exclusion in a number of measures, such as a hospice exclusion, this definition could be included within a standalone CQL library that includes other common definitions. Then when you're working on those measures, rather than writing the same thing over and over, you can just call the definition out of the common library. And we will get into how to do this just a little later in the presentation. The CQL Library tab functions very similar to the Measure Library tab. You still have the two tables, which will be filtered by My Libraries. To change that, again, you just uncheck the box and click Search again. All of the icons are in the tables, with the exception of the Export icon. Standalone CQL libraries do not have any populations or measure groupings and cannot be packaged. They are simply repositories for storing expressions, value sets, and/or codes with the express purpose of being used in measures. And at the top, we have the New Library icon to create a new standalone CQL library. So let's create one, and you can see the process. Clicking on the new library will take you to a screen where you give your new library a name. It's important that a CQL library name not contain any spaces or special characters other than an underscore, and it cannot begin with a number. Clicking Save and Continue will take you to the second tab, the CQL Composer tab. Again, here we have tried to keep the process of creating a standalone CQL library as similar to the process of creating a measure as possible. The same 8 sections are along the left-hand navigation. The 2 default codes and the default parameter have already been added, and as such you can just add any necessary value sets, codes, definitions, and/or functions just as you would in the CQL Workspace for a measure. Once you have entered all of the items you would like to live within your standalone CQL library, you need to version it before it can be added to a measure. To do this, we need to go back to the CQL library, and then we click on the gold star, choose a major or a minor version, and click Save and Continue. It's important to note that you will not be able to version a CQL library if there are validation errors within it. So now let's take a look at how to add a standalone CQL library into a measure. We're going to go back to the measure library, and we're going to open a measure. Then we're going to go to the Include section of the CQL Workspace. Upon entering this section, you will see a blank table with a search bar above it. Search for the name of the library you want to include within your measure. Possibilities for what can be included in a measure are any standalone CQL library that have been versioned, and any CQL library that was created within another measure that has been versioned. You will not see anything that's in a draft state within this table. Any library to be included must be given an alias. I'm going to call this one Included Library, just for demonstration purposes. And this alias will allow you to call the library within your logic. You then select the one that you would like to include, and you can see the CQL file of that library in this space below. This allows users to ensure that they have the correct library and to remind them of the content of that library. When you have the one that you want, you would click on the Save icon. You will see the alias that you gave your included library in the list box on the left-hand side of the screen. And you can include up to 10 different libraries within your measure. Once a library has been included within your measure, it will show in the search table with a green check mark to ensure that you cannot accidentally choose to include the same library again. You can open a library that you have already included by double-clicking on the alias in the left-hand side box. This will give you the owner's name, the alias that you've given the library, the name of the library as given by the owner, and the CQL file for that library. There are only 2 options from here. One is to close the screen with the X, and the other is to remove this CQL library from being included in your measure. To do this, you click on the trash can icon. You will receive a message asking you if this is really what you want to do, and then the library alias will be removed from your included libraries list. We will just click on Cancel and close the screen for now. Now that we have included a library into our measure, let's take a look at how to use those definitions in your CQL logic. In the first example, we're going to use the same initial population as the CQL library we just included. So we're going to create a new definition, and I'm going to call it Initial Population 2. Then in the CQL editor, I'm going to click on my Insert icon, choose Definitions, and then select the initial population that is coming from our included library. So you can note those by the alias name and a dot before the definition name. That indicates that these are the ones coming out of the included library. And we need the initial population, and then click Insert. Then click Save. Another option is to call the definition from the child logic and put more logic around it. We will call this one denominator 2. And click Add New. Go back to the Insert icon, choose Definitions. I'm going to choose that same initial population definition and click Insert. Then on the next line, I'm going to type AND, go back to my Insert icon, choose my predefined functions, choose age in years at, click Insert, put my cursor inside the parentheses and type start of. Use Control-Alt-P for my shortcut key to insert my parameter. Put my cursor outside of the parentheses, type greater than or equal to 18, and click Save. Additionally, when you include another library or libraries within your measure, you will generate additional exports upon packaging. So I'm going to quickly change out my populations and package this measure so you can take a look at that. So we're going to replace our original with our new initial population 2. And then in the denominator, I'm going to choose Replace and choose denominator 2. Save. Go to my measure packager. Got my same populations. I'm going to resave that grouping again because I changed the definitions out, and I want to make sure that the package grouping includes the most current definitions. And then I'm going to create package and export. And it takes just a moment. Open. So you can now see that because I've used logic out of my included library, the system will include a CQL file, an ELM file, and a JSON file for that included library, as well as the other exports that we've already talked about for the base measure. So that concludes the live portion of the MAT portion of this training session. So we're going to go back to the PowerPoint for some additional important information. MAT support is available to assist you during this transition. MAT support can be accessed via the Contact Us form on the Contact Us page of the MAT public website, which is www.emeasuretool.cms.gov. You can also call MAT support at 1-800-673-0655 Monday through Friday from 7:30 a.m. to 5 o'clock p.m. Central Time. It is closed on certain holidays, and again, the Contact Us page of the public website lists those holidays for you. You can also send an email to support@emeasuretool.org. The next steps for the MAT's transition to CQL. The measure authoring tool will be unavailable Thursday, November 9th, 2017 and Friday, November 10th, 2017 to facilitate the release of the MAT version 5.4. I did have a couple of questions from the last session. There will not be any access to creating measures with QDM logic past this Wednesday, November 8th, 2017. The system will be down the 9th and the 10th. We have regularly scheduled system maintenance over the weekend, and starting Monday, November 13th, the MAT will be using CQL for the measure logic. The MAT public website is also going to be updated during this time with information on the new system and the release notes, and a new user guide is going to be available for users shortly after the release.
So my name is Lizzie Charbonneau, and I will be speaking to you about Bonnie version 2.0 with CQL support. So for this agenda, we'll briefly go over Bonnie, talk about QDM logic versus CQL logic in Bonnie, talk about the Bonnie version 2.0 features, give an overview of the demo, and then give the demo itself, and then talk about the future of the QDM logic-based version of Bonnie, Bonnie version 1.6. We'll then review the Bonnie resources available and answer any questions. So Bonnie is an ECQM testing tool that allows measure developers to load ECQMs from the measure authoring tool, to build synthetic patients using metadata from those ECQMs, and then allows users to test the updated ECQMs using those synthetic patients that they created. It also allows users to explore the behavior and complexity characteristics of the ECQMs through logic highlighting and the complexity rating. And as mentioned, Bonnie will now be supporting the clinical quality language, which Don gave a very nice overview of. So this shows you QDM logic versus CQL in Bonnie. Here we have the measure details page in Bonnie with the QDM logic shown here. And here's the CQL logic. So the CQL, this measure details page here looks almost the same as the QDM logic-based version of Bonnie, with the exception of the logic portion, which shows the CQL logic, and the data criteria section, which has been changed somewhat, and we will go over that in more detail during the demo. Here's QDM logic in the patient builder view. Again, it's here in the lower right-hand corner. And we have CQL in the patient builder view. And once again, this looks almost identical to the QDM-based version. But here we have calculation results across the top, enabling measure developers to better see how their patient calculates against the measure. This is particularly convenient for episode of care-based measures where you may have multiple outputs for a particular population. And you also have the CQL logic in place of the QDM logic. So features in Bonnie version 2.0, we have loading, updating, and deleting CQL-based measures. We also have that you can create test cases for those measures as you could previously and calculate those test cases against the measures. We have coverage calculations and a logic highlighting included, as well as complexity calculation, and the ability to export the measure and patients using the Excel export feature. There are some features that measure developers may have become accustomed to that will not be included in Bonnie version 2.0 with CQL. Primarily, this is loading, updating, and deleting QDM logic-based measures. So Bonnie version 2.0 does not support QDM logic-based measures. There are also some features that were added in the last year or two to our QDM-based version of Bonnie that will not be included in the Bonnie version 2.0 for this annual update. These include measure history, patient dashboard, and the patient bank. Although we weren't able to get these in for this annual update period, we do hope to be able to get these in for future annual update periods. So a brief overview of what we'll be covering in the demo. We'll be looking at uploading a CQL-based measure and selecting the measure type, as well as the versions for the value sets. Will they be measure defined, or will we be grabbing the draft versions of those value sets? We'll take a look at the measure details page, look at the logic layout and the data criteria list, which, as I mentioned, has changed somewhat. We'll look at adding a test case and review the CQL logic coloring and highlighting. We will also look at editing, cloning, and deleting a test case, exploring the measure details page, looking at the pass-fail rate, coverage, and CQL logic coloring within the context of that page. And then we'll discuss updating and deleting a CQL-based measure. So I will dive into the demo now. So we're going to take a look at CMS 104. Which is an ischemic stroke measure. It takes a look at patients who are diagnosed with an ischemic stroke and whether or not they were prescribed antithrombotic therapy at hospital discharge. This is Bonnie, and this is our uploading page for uploading a measure. I will browse to CMS 104. I have already authenticated with VSAC on this session of Bonnie. But as Don mentioned, because the CQL packages will no longer contain the value set artifacts within them, you must log into VSAC every time you're going to be uploading a measure for that session. I'm going to be using the draft value sets for the value sets included in the measure. These access the latest draft versions of those value sets. If I selected measure defined, this would access the versions of the value sets that are defined within the measure. This is an eligible hospital measure and an episode of care measure. It's also worth noting that in previous version of Bonnie, in the QDM logic-based version of Bonnie, you could upload only the HQMS file. So you could upload just the HQMS XML file in the Bonnie version 1.6 and earlier. That is no longer the case. You now need to upload the entire MAT package for your measure to upload successfully in Bonnie. I'll now click load. Oh, it looks like there was an issue potentially with my VSAT credential. So one moment, let me log out and log back in for that and select these same options once again. So I now have that measure loaded. I will click into the measure to the measure details page. As I mentioned previously, this is very similar to the QDM logic-based view, with the exceptions being the logic itself. So you see here CQL-based logic in place of QDM logic. Each population has its own section. In addition, we do have this definition section here, which includes definitions used within the measure. And then a function section, which includes all of the functions within the measure and the reference libraries. And this unused definition section, which includes definitions within the libraries that weren't used within the measure, or definitions used within other populations or stratifications that aren't in this particular population or stratification for measures with multiples of those. I will now add a new patient. And this patient will have had an ischemic stroke and not received medication. As a result, I expect them to be in the initial population and in the denominator, but not in the numerator. I'll make this patient be an adult, and I'll give this patient a non-elective inpatient encounter. And I'll scroll down through the logic and show the logic coloring and logic highlighting that we have in place for the CQL logic-based version of Bonnie. So as you can see here, statements that are evaluating as satisfied show up with green highlighting and a solid underline. Logic that shows up as unsatisfied shows up with red highlighting and a double underline. When I hover over logic statements that are related to elements in the patient history, so that are directly related, you see that that element in the patient history does highlight. This will make it easier to debug any issues within the CQL or issues in the patient history. If we take a look at this definition statement, this definition statement is looking for a non-elective inpatient encounter with the principal diagnosis in the value sets of hemorrhagic stroke or ischemic stroke. You'll notice that the hemorrhagic stroke and ischemic stroke are colored as green. This is because they are referencing value sets, and value sets will always be returning a value, so they're always satisfied. You'll note that principal diagnosis is red in both of these cases. This is because there is no principal diagnosis on this encounter. So I'll go ahead and add a principal diagnosis, but have it be different than hemorrhagic stroke or ischemic stroke. So go ahead and add this on. And you can now see that principal diagnosis is showing as satisfied, but we still haven't satisfied this definition. And you can see why, because these in statements are still highlighting as unsatisfied, meaning we do have a principal diagnosis, but it is not in the hemorrhagic stroke or ischemic stroke value set. I'll now delete this principal diagnosis, add a new one in for ischemic stroke, and you can see that this logic statement is now satisfied. If we scroll up to the top, we can see that my initial population and denominator sections are now satisfied. And you can see the calculation results of 1 and 1 for the initial population and denominator and 0 for the other populations, corresponding with the expected values for this patient. I'll now go ahead and click Save. So you can now see on the measure details page additional information. We still have our coverage results here. So we have our passing results here. We have 100% pass rate with 1 of 1 patients passing. We also have 49% coverage, meaning that we have 49% of our logic covered by our current bank of test cases. Coverage is demonstrated with blue highlighting and a dashed underline. If I expand this patient, you can now see the calculation results within the logic, as well as the calculation results between the expected and actual values here. You have the option of editing your patient, of cloning your patient, or deleting your patient. I'll go ahead and clone this patient. Cloning means I will retain all of the patient history and metadata for that patient in a new patient. I'll go ahead and rename this patient. This patient will have received medication on discharge. So I will now expect this patient to be within the numerator. I'll go ahead and add the medication discharge to my patient history. And you can see that my calculation result did go to 1. And if I scroll down to the numerator section, you can see that it is highlighting as satisfied. I'll go ahead and save the patient. And you can now see that my coverage percentage has increased as I'm now satisfying more portions of the logic. I'll go ahead and delete this patient so you can just see how that works. So you click the delete button here and then here to delete the patient. And you can see my coverage percentage has dropped back down. If I wanted to update the measure, I would click this gear icon and the update button and then navigate to my new version of the measure. I can also delete this measure by clicking the delete button here and then the delete here. That concludes the demo portion. I will now return to the presentation. So many of you may be wondering what will be happening to the QDM logic-based version of Bonnie, as well as your accounts, measures, and test cases. So we do understand that during the transition year, measure developers will need to compare calculations between their CQL-based versions of measures and their former QDM logic-based versions of the measures. We will also note that Bonnie version 2.0 with CQL support will not support QDM logic-based versions of measures. And moving forward, the Bonnie version 2.0 and above will only support one version of the QDM model at a time. We also recognize that there is a diverse Bonnie user base, some of whom require the Bonnie instance to support this year's annual update of measures for the measure developers drafting and working on measures for this annual update, as well as users who require to be able to use the published versions of measures within Bonnie. So recognizing those two use cases, there will be two versions of Bonnie that will be publicly available at a time moving forward. There will be the production version of Bonnie, bonnie.healthit.gov, which will have the Bonnie version to support this year's annual update of measures. It will support the latest version of the QDM model used in whatever this year's annual update QDM model would be. We will also have bonnieprior.healthit.gov, which will support the prior year's version of Bonnie for the prior year's annual update and the corresponding QDM model. To show what this will look like, our current situation now is we have on our production instance of Bonnie, bonnie.healthit.gov, the Bonnie version 1.6 with QDM logic. And then we have on our test instance of Bonnie, bonniealpha.arcstage.org, we have our test instance of Bonnie version 2.0 with CQL. This website will be going away November 15th. Then November 13th and 14th, both the production server and this testing server will be down in preparation for the release of Bonnie version 2.0 on our production server November 15th. So starting November 15th, we will have on our production server Bonnie version 2.0 with CQL and at bonnie.healthit.gov, and then Bonnie prior with Bonnie version 1.6 with the QDM logic at bonnieprior.healthit.gov. Bonnie version 1.6 on bonnieprior.healthit.gov will include all of the account, measures, and test cases that existed on the production version of Bonnie. So all of the existing measures and test cases that measure developers have been using with the QDM logic version of Bonnie, Bonnie version 1.6, will be available on bonnieprior.healthit.gov. It is worth noting, however, that on Bonnie version 2.0, users will need to create new accounts on that version of Bonnie if they do not already have an account on bonniealpha.arcstage.org. If developers had an account on our testing server, these will be transferred over when we do our production release of Bonnie version 2.0. When we've fully transitioned to use CQL, which we expect to occur November 2018 and forward, the production instance of Bonnie will, like I said, always have the current version of Bonnie for that year's annual update, and Prior will have the version of Bonnie for the prior year's annual update, with the expectation that these will be CQL versions of Bonnie. Bonnie resources include the Bonnie website itself, bonnie.healthit.gov. We also have a website for tracking any issues that users may have when using Bonnie. This is the ONC project tracker. You can also contact the Bonnie development team at Bonnie feedback list at list.miter.org. It's worth noting that this feedback list will change. We will send out notifications with the new address when it becomes available. You can also view the source code for Bonnie, which is an open source project, at github.com at the noted link here.
So for additional information on CQL, again, check out the eCQI Resource Center, which is https://ecqi.healthit.gov/CQL. There's also the CQL Formatting and Usage Wiki, which you can find at this link here on the screen. The HL7 Standard Clinical Quality Language Specification Release 1. I was told yesterday this is now just STU, so ignore the D. And that is at this link here. We also have the HL7 CDS Workgroup project homepage, which can be found here. There's also CQL questions and answers posted here. And for any assistance or questions regarding CQL, you can submit a ticket to the CQL JIRA issue tracker, which is https://ONC-project-tracking.healthit.gov//CQLIT/issues/CQLIT-58 filter equals all open issues. Please stay tuned to hear a disclaimer regarding this presentation. This presentation was prepared as a tool to assist providers and is not intended to grant rights or impose obligations. Although every reasonable effort has been made to assure the accuracy of the information within these pages, the ultimate responsibility for the correct submission of claims and response to any remittance advice lies with the provider of services. This publication is a general summary that explains certain aspects of the Medicare program, but is not a legal document. The official Medicare program provisions are contained in the relevant laws, regulations, and rulings. Medicare policy changes frequently, and links to the source documents have been provided within this document for your reference. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, employees, agents, and staff make no representation, warranty, or guarantee that this compilation of Medicare information is error-free and will bear no responsibility or liability for the results or consequences of the use of this guide.